thank you so much. Welcome, welcome, welcome to the Lisa Prento Team Monthly Mastermind. It is October 2022, and I am thrilled to death to have as a special guest this morning Patty Flowers, who is a 1031 exchange expert. Actually, we did a deal together years ago. It was one of my first 1031 exchanges ever, and I think the rules have changed a little bit. There was a lot of anxiety about it actually being removed from the tax code, but it is still there in large measure because of your RPAC dollars lobbying in Washington to make sure that a 1031 exchange was still available for ourselves and our investor clients. Thank you so much for joining us. I know your time is very valuable, everybody. So we have a ton to get to. I know Patty has a nice presentation. Actually, can't wait to hear more about that. And with no further ado, I'm gonna pin you, Patty. Oh, there you are.
Okay.
And yeah, we'd love to, hey, just jump right in. But also, if you want to give a little background, I know, as I was saying earlier, we did a deal together years ago. And that was the first time I'd ever been actively involved with a 1031 exchange. I knew what it was because of just being a wonk and going to different workshops at NAR and things like that on 1031 exchange. But I'd never had been involved with one personally. And I think there's a lot of restrictions and information on both sides of the deal that it would be really great for realtors in general to get their arms around and then be able to find some partners to share with. So, with all that being said, please help us get a little smarter.
Oh, I would love that. Happy to help. So I'm just going to key up the presentation. Can everyone see it's a green, blue, and white screen?
We sure can. Yep.
Perfect. So thank you so much, Lisa. It was great to be on here today, and just shows how many years we've all been doing real estate and exchanges, right? So I think that the 1031 exchange, although it seems like it has a lot of rules and it's difficult to follow, really has some basic concepts. And I think as you're out there day to day, you're usually the front line of defense against or with clients and talking to them. And they're the first ones to probably ask you about the 1031 exchange and if they could do it and how it works. So I guess my goal in this hour is just to try to give you a little bit of information to use, have certainly some background in it. We'll talk about how, a lot of vacation and second home rules and how they work for people now currently and in the future. Can they convert it to their personal use down the road or their retirement home? And we'll talk about all that. And then just know that you can use me as a resource going forward anytime.
That'd be awesome. So, can you give a little background, I'm going to mute myself after that, but can you just tell us a little bit about you, Patty, and how you got involved with this and what your career is? I'd just love to have a little background about you before we jump into the actual weeds of the exchanges.
Sure. Yeah, so I'm Patty Flowers, and I'm based in Boston, and I manage the New England area, but my clients sell and buy all over the country. And our company is called Investment Property Exchange, or really we go by IPX 1031 is the short name. And we're strictly a qualified intermediary. So the IRS says you need a neutral third party to facilitate the exchange, and that's what we do. So I've been doing this for many years now as the QI for IPX in this area. And my background is actually mostly real estate. So I used to do mortgage lending, and then I worked for a real estate software company that used the software to create closing packages. So I knew lots and lots of law firms and title companies and brokers and everyone kind of involved in the real estate process when I started doing exchanges. So certainly a learning curve a bit in the beginning, but now I've been doing it for many years. And I love the 1031. It's just such a win-win for everybody. It's great for the advisors. It's great for the realtors. Of course, it's great for the clients because they're saving taxes. And it really doesn't hurt anybody. There's no downside to a 1031. And as you alluded to, the IRS and the government, depending on who's in Washington at the time, sometimes tries to poke at 1031. But I think they've learned over the years, and we've worked really hard with NAR and CCIM and a lot of the commercial brokerages, AARP even, and the Farmers Bureau, and a lot of in the tax and legal communities have really kind of bonded together to try to explain that 1031 doesn't hurt the economy, it actually helps the economy. So it gives people the ability to keep money with them and use it to buy other property. So it keeps the economy moving. It keeps developers and builders and contractors in play. It helps tougher hit areas and maybe lower expanded areas to be able to people to be able to buy into those, fix those properties up and use them as investment. So it helps areas that might be more demographically challenged than others. So 1031 is really all around a great program. And I think they finally kind of got a handle on that. So what we'll do this morning is we'll just kind of run through some of the criteria of the 1031 exchange. For some of you, this may be repeat. You already know this information, and for others, it might be new. But very often, I have the same questions over and over again, even if we worked together before, or people hear misinformation, or they're looking on the internet. And so I want to make sure we try to go through the timelines and the dollar value rules. We're going to talk a lot about qualified property. When can you do an exchange? Can you live in it? Can you use it for a vacation or second home? Can you flip it? All these different criteria for what qualifies, we're going to walk through in this hour. So you're all probably aware of Section 121. That's the primary residence exclusion. So if your client is selling a property and they've lived there 2 of the last 5 years, as their primary residence, and it has to be 2 full calendar years as of the last 5, then when they go to sell the property, they can use the primary residence exemption. And what that says is that if an individual, you can get the first $250,000 of gain tax-free. And if you're a married couple, you can get $500,000 of the gain tax-free. So for anyone who's been in a property where they've lived there 2 of the last 5 years, you always want to look to that first and make sure that if they're in that realm, they use the 121 exclusion, because that's tax-free, no strings attached, not a lot of rules. You just sell it as is. You use your accountant to report that you had a primary residence sale at tax time. You do or do not have to go on and buy another primary residence. So that's pretty clean cut. So you always want to rule that out first, because that's, I think, the best bang for their buck when you're selling. For all other property, you look to the tax code number 1031 to see if they qualify. So the 1031 is called a tax deferred exchange, or they do call it a like kind exchange, but you'll see in a few screens that's a little bit misleading. Like kind is actually pretty flexible for 1031. But what the 1031 code says is that if you set your investment property sale up as an exchange, you use a neutral third party in the middle, which is what we do at IPX, and you follow all the rules in the middle and go on and buy other property, you could defer up to 100% of your capital gains tax that would otherwise be due. So for example, if you bought a property for, say, $200,000 and you're going to turn around and sell it for $500,000, and it's been a rental for 3 or 4 or 10 years, whatever, you made $300,000 as your gain, and I'm just using easy math, round numbers. But you bought it for $200,000. All these years you've been renting it, and now you're going to sell it for $5,000. Your gain is $300,000, give or take. If you sell that property outright, you're going to owe about 28% in taxes. And in some states, up to 1/3 in taxes on that. So you might owe $70,000, $80,000, or $100,000 in taxes on that one sale. That's a lot of money to lose just out the door just because you had a closing. So the 1031 program is set up so when you have that sale prior to the closing, and we'll talk about how that all works, you can set your sale up as an exchange, go on and buy other investment property to satisfy the code, and actually defer paying the taxes. You can keep that whole $300,000 in gain, or that 70, 80, 100,000 that you would have had to pay in taxes, keep it with you and roll it into the next property. So now you have more buying power on the buy side. You haven't paid the taxes to the government, so you're able to use that equity going forward. So that's kind of the basic premise, and we'll do some details about the dollar value rules and everything as we get going. and how closing costs and real estate commissions and everything fit in. But that's the basic premise of the exchange. So in the section 121 with your primary residence, it's tax-free. You sell your primary residence, you follow the rules, you save that $250 or $500 tax-free. In a 1031, it's called a tax deferral, meaning that they calculate what your gain was, but if you do an exchange and report it at tax time and you follow all the rules, you can defer paying it, but that gain is sitting on paper waiting for down the road. So we'll talk about some of the ways that you can maybe get out of paying the tax at the end. But that is the premise for 1031. So I talked about it being upwards of 25, 28, 30% in taxes. On the federal level, your federal capital gains tax is either 15 or 20%, and that just really depends on your income. This number changes a little bit each year. So it doesn't follow what your income is for the year, necessarily like your tax bracket. It's a flat fee. It's either 15 or 20%, depending on your income on the year that you sell. Down below a little bit here, this says gain due to depreciation. So that's another federal tax. When you take normal wear and tear and write-offs every year on your property, when it's an investment property, that's great. You appreciate that on your tax return. But when you go to sell the property, the IRS wants some of those write-offs back. So they call it a depreciation recapture tax. So the depreciation recapture tax is actually 25%. So when you're calculating your gains, whatever your gain is on the sale, you're going to pay 25% on the depreciation you've taken. Then the rest of the gain is going to be taxed federally at either 15 or 20. State capital gains taxes fall into play. Everyone's a little bit different. They may range from 0 in some states, 5% in Massachusetts. Other surrounding New England states are 6.9, 7.5. And then, of course, they differ across the country. You can go to the IPX website and look for a map, a tax map, and it shows what that capital gains tax from a state perspective is in every state. The fourth tax that sometimes comes into play is called the 3.8 healthcare tax. So if you remember a few years ago from the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, they were trying to improve the healthcare system, and they said that if anyone makes over a certain income in 1 year, net investment income, then they're going to be taxed an additional 3.8 to help the healthcare system. So you might be going along in all your years not even noticing. 1 year you might have some good stock sales, you might sell some real estate, you have some other investment that comes in that was not normal to your year, and all of a sudden you're bumped up and might owe the 3.8%. So when clients are thinking about doing an exchange, I can kind of generally run the numbers with them. What did you buy it for? How much are you selling it for? And walk through this, but they really should always go back to their tax advisor and say, I'm thinking of selling. Can you calculate the depreciation for me, the federal tax, and the state tax? Because sometimes they'll say, oh, it's just 15%. It's pretty low, but it's really never just 15%. It's all of these combined. So you really want the clients to go back and calculate with their tax advisor, what would I pay in taxes if I sold it outright? And then they have a clear picture if with the 1031 exchange is worth it for them. So this is just a high-end example, easy math, round numbers, perfect world, right? So the property, if you're selling a property for $1 million, you have a basis of 100,000. So you've owned it for quite a long time. You've depreciated it quite a bit, and you have a great sale price. So that means your gain is $900,000. So if you had to sell that property outright, again, you might owe, 20, 30% in taxes on that. So in this example, if you sold for $1 million, you might have to set aside 225 for taxes on the gain and only have the 775 left to reinvest. If you set that same sale up as an exchange, the point of the matter is that this estimated tax you would owe could be deferred, and you could take that and go on and buy other property with it. So you would actually have $1 million to reinvest. So of course, this doesn't take into consideration closing costs and all of that. So we won't worry about all that right now. Just like I said, the round numbers. But just this is how it works for a 1031 exchange. So obviously nobody wants to pay the taxes, right? Number one reason why you would do an exchange, but there's plenty of other reasons why you might not. So just kind of following around here. Cash flow. Actually, raw land or vacant land qualifies as a 1031 property for an exchange. So you might have a piece of land or it was inherited, or you bought it and you thought you were going to build on it, decided not to. You're paying the real estate taxes on it every year, and it's just sitting there doing nothing. So you could actually sell the land as an exchange and turn around and buy an improved property, something that you were going to get rental or lease income from, and immediately you're getting cash flow. Depreciation, I talked about a little bit. Sometimes you'll have clients who've owned property for many years, and they'll say, oh, this property is fully depreciated. I cannot get the write-offs. I want to do an exchange. Appreciation, I know it seems a little silly right now. Where is the slow market? But, real estate ebbs and flows. So sometimes you have people who own a property in a lower income market or a slower market. And if they wanted to bump up the rents, they'd have to fix it up quite a bit. It might not be worth it to them, but instead they might sell that property and they could buy something in the same town or the next town over or next state over. It doesn't matter where. But maybe it's in a better area, or it's getting better rental income, or it's near the city, or it's near the water, or near transportation. Whatever that cue is, it's going to help it. So it might be a better looking property and they just get better rents. So you might do an exchange just to bump up your rent income. On the top here, joint ownership problems. We'll talk about this a little bit today, but this is really set aside for an advanced class. In a 1031 exchange, any entity can do an exchange. So an individual, trust, an LLC, a partnership, but that same entity has to go on and buy other property. So sometimes you might have co-owners, 2 or 3 people on title to a property that are not related, not husband and wife, and they want to go their separate ways. So an exchange can sometimes help that situation too, to split them up as tenants in common and sell and take their money and split. Reduce management burdens. There are properties out there for a 1031 exchange that are more hands-off properties. They call them sometimes armchair investments. And they're called DST, or Delaware Statutory Trust Programs. There are single net lease or triple net lease properties that you can purchase. So you might have a client locally that's selling something, but they don't want to buy anything else. They're tired of renting and the tenants and the toilets and getting the phone calls. Like, they just don't want to manage it anymore. So they don't want to sell because they don't want to pay the taxes. So they don't want to buy something else locally that they have to manage still. So some of these properties that are more hands-off are conducive to them for an exchange, because they can go into a property, own a percentage of the whole, get income and expenses and write-offs without the day-to-day work. So down in the bottom left and over here on the right, estate planning and conversion. So we're going to talk about these in detail in a little bit. But from an estate planning point of view, people will do a 1031 exchange and go on and buy other property, and they might exchange. They might keep going on over the years, and as their interests change for investment property, they might sell and do another exchange. So when you do an exchange, your basis, and I mentioned the depreciation taken and everything, it follows you. Your gain follows you from property to property. So sometimes people will allude to exchange, and die. So although we don't want to hear anything about that right now, what happens is if you keep exchanging and then you sell outright at the end, that gain that you've been deferring over the years, and maybe you had a gain and a loss and they kind of offset, but at the end, when you sell outright, all the taxes are due. So when people keep exchanging and they own their property as part of an exchange, if they pass away, the estate gets the property at the value of that property at the date of their death. So now the estate can take the property and turn around and sell it for that value and not have any capital gains tax due. That's called a step up in basis. So their basis has been following them all along in the exchange. When they pass, the basis bumps up to the date of death for their heirs and passes to them capital gains tax-free. So that's a huge estate planning tool. And a lot of people think of that so they can get the income and have the investment and everything while they're alive, but it's also something for their heirs for their future. Conversion, when people are doing exchanges, they might be exchanging from rental to rental or investment. They can use commercial and all different types, but they might buy a property as replacement that's in an area that they plan to retire to someday. So you can do a 1031 exchange. It should definitely be a rental when you buy it, and we'll talk about that a little bit. But going forward down the line, they might convert it to their personal use. So these are all different reasons why you might do an exchange. I mentioned that like kind is very flexible for 1031 and a little misleading. In a 1031, anything that you hold for investment or business use is like kind to any other type of real property that you hold for business or investment use. So it's strictly for real estate property, but the type of property and how it looks can vary. So if you sell a condo, you do not necessarily have to buy another condo. Or if you sell a commercial building, you don't have to necessarily buy another commercial building. You can sell residential and buy commercial. You can buy industrial, single families and multifamilies and condos. I already mentioned that land counts as an exchange, so that's fine as well. Then the bottom here, this bullet, the leased properties in the tenant in common realm, single net lease or DST programs, those all qualify too. Sometimes I've had clients who've sold 2 or 3 properties to combine the money and buy one larger property. And sometimes I have clients that are selling one property, and because they have so much equity, they want to take it and spread it out. Now they might want to buy 2 or 3 properties as replacement. So you can mix and match types of properties any way you want to satisfy what your plan is. The one thing I would caution on down in the bottom here is about flipping properties. So when people buy a property to fix up and resell, so they're going to buy it, fix it up, maybe it takes a couple months or even longer, and they turn around and put it on the market to sell. That's traditionally what we consider a flip. So buying properties primarily for resale or to flip them does not qualify according to the IRS. Even though it's considered an investment property because you're putting your money into it and you're going to make money on it, from an IRS perspective, they consider it inventory as if you're a dealer or a developer. So if you buy a property, fix it up, and your intention is to flip it, you're getting permitting, you're putting up a live here sign, or you're marketing the property, those flip properties should not be exchanges. It's really up to the client and their tax advisor to talk about it and determine whether they qualify or not. But at first glance, you have to be careful because at tax time, they ask right on the return, what was the date purchased and the date sold? So if those 2 dates are close together, you don't know what kind of flag that causes. They're actually, though, on the flip side of that, there's no exact timeline of how long you have to own the property. So most people think at least 1 year is comfortable. If you've been renting or leasing out a property for a year, that's fine. There are a lot of advisors who feel 2 years is more conservative. You should hold something for 2 years. But if it's a straight year-round rental with no personal use, usually after a year or so, if you decide to sell it, you could do an exchange. There's also a different type of property that we consider mixed use property. And so this is a combination of personal use property, maybe it's a primary residence or a vacation home property, and a combination of investment use. So the easiest example probably is a multifamily. So say that you have a 3-family, 3-unit building, you live in 1 unit and you rent the other 2 units out. In the exchange, you can set it up for the 2 rental units. So you've been declaring this is your primary residence each year, but you've also been declaring income, write-offs, expenses, depreciation taken for the rental units. So there's a clear paper trail on your tax return that it's part personal use and part investment use. So when you go to sell that property, it's a percentage. What percentage of the client's property have they been declaring each year as investment? You'll use that same percentage for the sale. So, for example, you had a 3-family property for $900,000 you were selling, and each unit is even square footage, a third, a third, a third. You live in one unit and you rent the other 2 out. So if you're selling the property for $900,000, it's just one deed, one seller, one buyer, one P&S agreement, everything's normal. But at closing, it's actually 2 tax transactions. It's a primary residence sale for the 1/3 that you live in, and it's an investment sale that can be a 1031 exchange for the 2/3, the 2 units or 600,000 that you rent out. So the same holds true like in B&Bs. Maybe they live in 8% or 10% or 12% of the property and the rest is investment. You might have properties that have larger acreage. So you might have a primary residence house on the property or a personal vacation home on the property, but you might also have another building that's a rental. So same theory, whatever percentage of the property you own, you declare each year as investment and rental. You can use that same fact pattern going forward for a sale and for an exchange. So everything goes as normal, one sale, one closing, one deed, one everything. But for my eyes and for the accountant's eyes, it's actually 2 tax transactions. Other things that qualify, if anyone works in the commercial world, leases with at least 30 years remaining, including the renewal options, will qualify for a 1031 exchange. So if you are selling a property, you have a 10-year lease and at least 2 10-year renewals left when you sign the P&S agreement, that can be exchanged as real property, and you can go on and buy another 30-year plus lease, or you can buy something straight out. They call it fee simple. Cell phone towers and perpetual easements can also be done as a 1031 exchange. Undivided interest in a property. So you might own a percentage. So John Smith and David Jones might have combined their money to buy a property. They're each on title as what we call tenants in common. It might be called different things in different states, but 2 different people are on title. They own an investment property and they each file their percentage on their own return each year. So when they go to sell, one can take his money and pay the tax, and one can take his money and do an exchange. Or they could both do exchanges and go their separate ways. As long as they've been reporting separately under their own tax ID numbers to the IRS, they can go forward the same way. And a lot of those are case by case that we talk about one-on-one. Timber rights, riparian rights, which are water rights, anything that's governed by state law, if you're selling in that particular state and it's considered real property, it can be done as a 1031 exchange. So back to the qualifying properties with personal use. So I mentioned that when you own a property and it's a full year-round rental, there's no timeline written in the tax code, surprisingly. At one point, long time ago, decades ago, they tried to put in a 2-year rule and it never stuck. So to date, we really haven't had any guidance on it. So again, most advisors feel if you own something for at least 1 year, that's considered investment and fine for an exchange. However, in the vacation and second home realm, it's different. So if you own a property that's in a vacation or second home area that you do not rent out year round, so it's seasonal, you rent it out only in the summer, or you're in ski country and you only rent it in the winter. Some areas might have a few extra seasons that it can be rented. You might do Airbnb or VBRO or whatever it may be. So in that scenario, you're filing rental income, you're showing in depreciation and expenses, but not as a full year-round rental. So when you have those properties and you want to sell them and do an exchange, they have very specific rules. So we call them the vacation and second home rules. And in 2008, the IRS actually came out with a regulation on these because previous to that, many people, it seems like, must have been doing vacation and second homes as exchanges, buying retirement homes and just vacation homes. And the IRS said, oh, no, that's not what 1031 is for. So here are the rules. Number one, the taxpayer must have owned the property for at least 24 months prior to the exchange. So 2 full calendar years, they must have been on title owning the property before the sale can close. Number two, in that time frame, the taxpayer must have rented the property out 14 days or more in each of those 2 12-month cycles. So that sounds easy to do, right? You could rent a property for 2 weeks to somebody. You want it to be fair market value. You want to have leases in place and things like that. But the trick is number three. So if you only rent it for 2 weeks a year, you still have to follow this next rule. The taxpayer's personal use in this property, they call it personal use and enjoyment, cannot exceed 14 days per year or 10% of the total time rented. So if you only rent out your property 2, 3, 4, 5 weeks a year, you can only be there 2 weeks a year. The rest of the time, what's going to happen? It must have to sit vacant, right? So this is the tricky part. People have properties, especially in certain areas where it is just the summer months. Maybe they open it in April or May and they close it down in October or November. But specifically, the rental market is pretty quick. It's pretty short in vacation and second home areas. And so you want to try to rent it out as much as possible and not use it more than 14 days per year. The 10% exception, sometimes people qualify for this. A good example might be if you're in an area that has, I've noticed, private schools, colleges or private schools, where you have teachers and professors who are there for the school year, maybe say September to June, pretend that's 300 days a year. But when school's over, they leave to go vacation somewhere else. So you might have a property and you rent it out to these professors or advisors for 300 days a year. Now you can use it 30 days a year without issue. So that's the 10% of the total time rented rule. If your property's been a rental and it qualifies, or maybe it's been a year-round rental, it's totally fine. It absolutely qualifies. The same rules apply going forward on the new replacement property that you're going to buy. So again, when you buy a new property, you have to own it for at least 2 full calendar years going forward. In each of those 2 years going forward in the replacement, you have to rent it at least 14 days per year, and you cannot use it more than 14 days per year, or 10% of the total time rented. So it gets a little tricky. And usually the first question everyone ever asks me is, how do they know if I'm there or not there? Well, so I have no idea. Certainly you hope they're not driving around behind you, tracking your steps. That would be bad, right? But what you really want to be careful for is how you're showing it. How much are you reporting on your tax return? Are you showing the full rental income and expenses? I have heard when you're audited that they will come, and if they're looking at this particular topic, for example, they might look for your ATM cards or credit card receipts. Were you spending money in the area of your second home? They check your Easy Pass. Were you driving through tolls that got you to your second home? If you've been there, were you living on this property, or maybe you had another property that you were staying at? So this one's okay. So again, not up to us as a qualified intermediary. I always say we're not the exchange police. You don't have to prove anything to me, but I do want you to always understand the vacation and second home rules and make sure that the clients understand the vacation and second home rules so that they can make an informed decision with their tax advisor. Now, a lot of people use this for their future plans, right? So you might see people who have a full year-round rental and they do a 1031 exchange and they buy another full year-round rental, but it happens to be in a property in an area that they want to retire to someday or they're thinking about. So they buy the property as replacement, they rent it year-round, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years. And then they decide, okay, I'm going to stop renting it and I'm going to convert it to my primary residence, or I'm going to convert it to be a straight second home with no rental. As of right now, there's any information on the books that says you cannot do that. This ruling for Revenue Procedure 2008-16 only talks about 2 years prior and 2 years going forward. It does not mention any timeline after that. So of course, most tax advisors want to be conservative and they want you to keep renting it as long as you can and it's feasible for you. But there's nothing to say that you can't convert it to your primary residence or second home down the road. So people will buy in an area that they want to retire to, do the exchange, not pay any taxes if they did a full exchange. So they've saved the money from the capital gains tax. And then 3 or 5 or 10 years later, they decide to sell their primary residence. They might get that section 121 I talked about with the 250,000 or 500,000 exclusion on gain. Then they'll take their rental property that they have in the other location and convert it to their primary residence. So it really is a good estate planning tool. We always want the clients to talk to their advisors about it and make sure it's right for them. And I do also tell people, if this is your plan for the future, you should check back with IPX or check back with your tax advisor when you get closer to doing that, just to be sure the rules haven't changed, because certainly the IRS can change the 1031 or any section of the tax code. They can change their rules, at their wish, and as long as it's voted in or whatever the circumstances are. So you always want people to be double checking, but it is a great estate planning tool. I do have clients who planning ahead, they want to convert their property to a primary residence down the line, but then they think, okay, well, later on, if I live in that property for 2 of the last 5 years, it used to be a rental, now I moved into it. If I live in there for at least 2 years, I can turn around and sell that as a primary residence sale back under that section 121 and get out of paying the capital gains tax altogether. So it sounds like a great plan. However, the IRS did figure out that people were doing that and changed the rules on that as well. So still not terrible, but just not as wonderful as tax-free. So in this example, the taxpayer did an exchange. So they sold investment property, they bought another residential property, and they rented it out. Then they moved into it and lived in it for at least 2 years. So the taxpayer decides to sell it later on. So instead of getting the full 250 or 500,000 exclusion on gain because they were there 2 of the last 5 years, instead it's a prorated event if you look towards the bottom. So what happens is 4 out of 6 of the years of the gain would not qualify for the 121 because they rented it for 4 years. The 2 years that they lived there would qualify under section 121. So 2/6 or 1/3 of the gain would be due when they sell it. So they still aren't paying all the tax. They do have some kind of break. So it's still a great estate planning tool again. So if you do a 1031 exchange, you buy a property that you're renting out, it's investment, it qualifies for 1031 through and through. Later on, you decide to move into it and make it your primary residence. When you sell that, if and when you sell that property, you don't necessarily have to, you're going to get a prorated event for the number of years it was your primary residence versus the total years of ownership. And that's the percentage you'll get capital gains tax free under the 121 regulation. Hope that's clear for everybody. So I'll just continue on with some other points that I just want to make sure everybody knows for the 1031. So as Lisa and I talked about in the beginning, I'm from IPX and we're a qualified intermediary. So the IRS says you need a neutral third party to set up the exchange or facilitate the exchange and hold the money in between the sale and the purchase. So one of the key factors in a 1031 exchange to qualify, besides the property itself, is that the owner, excuse me, the owner or the seller cannot touch the money in between the sale and the purchase. They need a neutral third party. So anyone who represents them or has done business with them in the last 2 years also cannot be their intermediary. So that might be the realtor, the attorney, the CPA, the financial advisor. They cannot hold the money. So you really need this neutral third party. So that's what IPX does. So we set up an exchange account. We hold the funds in between. We, most importantly, I feel like, give a lot of guidance. So I'm not allowed to give tax advice as an intermediary, but we do give guidance, and we try to make sure that everybody understands up front in the initial conversations what qualifies and what doesn't, what are the dollar value rules, what are the timelines, answer any questions that the client has and the investor, and make sure that they know what they're doing before the exchange starts. So there are some areas that people think are very black and white, and others might interpret as gray. So we try to sift through that, make sure they understand their choices and can talk to their advisors to make the best decision. So not only do we just hold the money and act like an escrow agent, I think for IPX and for myself, certainly, we try to make sure that everyone understands the rules and help them as part of their team to structure the transactions for the best outcome. In a normal 1031 exchange, the deed goes directly from seller to buyer. So what will happen in the exchange is the listing goes completely as normal. You list the property, you entertain offers, you accept the best offer, the realtor or the title company or the firm can hold the deposit, it's fine. But once there's a signed sales agreement, that's when we as the intermediary get officially involved. So we'll get a copy of that signed contract. I read through it, talk to the clients, their advisors, make sure everyone understands and make sure I understand the transaction. And then we open an exchange account. So it is similar to an escrow account, except we have a lot more rules to ours than a regular basic escrow. So we're going to prepare documents for the exchange. We open up a bank account specifically under the seller's names and take in information right from the sales contract. They fill out a W-9 for us. They have documents to sign. And specific to IPX, we never commingle funds. So we actually open a separate bank account for every single seller exchanger that we have in the country. So that account is opened up in the name of the seller under their tax ID or EIN numbers. That means that IPX or our parent company, Fidelity National Financial, does not own the money. We're just the manager of the account. So the security in that is that if creditors or anybody wherever come at IPX or come at FNF, they cannot get at the client's money. It is protected. It's under their names and their tax ID numbers, social security numbers, or their EIN number if it's a corporate entity. And so that money is truly the taxpayers and not IPX's. We're just managing it because the IRS says we have to. So when you're looking for a qualified intermediary, you really want to talk about, who are they? How long have they been in business? Who are they connected to? Just like you have your Association of Realtors groups and NAR, we have one. We have FEA, which is the Federation of Exchange Accommodators. But a little bit of a different twist, there is no oversight and no regulatory body for qualified intermediaries. So this FEA is just a group of everyone in the QI industry that came together, but they are not a regulatory body. They cannot dictate to anybody. So you could think being a QI is a great job. This is easy. This is awesome. Love to do it, and turn around and set up your own QI shop tomorrow, and you're in. There are some states that have some regulation that you have to follow, but the majority of states don't. It's kind of strange, actually. I know years ago we lobbied quite heavily for regulation because there had been some problems in the QI industry, and the IRS didn't think it was necessary. We weren't, I guess, big enough to regulate as a whole. So you want to be careful for that. How are the funds held? Who do you have access to? Is it just one person in the company, or are there multiple people where you can contact? If one is out, you can get a hold of another. Insurance and how they're bonded. So for example, at IPX, we have 100 million Fidelity bond, 30 million E&O, and a written guarantee of funds. Some people only have $1 million bond and no guarantees, and some have some in the middle. So you want to be looking for that as well. And just industry expertise. And certainly you can refer to others. And I know the internet, you can look online a lot and try to gather information as well. But you just want to be careful, and you always want to ask questions. Who's the qualified intermediary that's going to be holding the funds? Whoops. So when you do your contract, your sales agreement or your purchase agreement, there's what they call a cooperation clause. And I think some of you have seen those over the years. It's just a little paragraph that lets everybody know there's going to be an exchange. But I do want you all to know that this is not mandatory. You do not have to put it in the listing. You do not have to put it in an offer. And if it's not in the contract itself, it's still okay, because when it comes to us, we actually prepare a notice of assignment. We put in a cooperation clause and send out a notice that says, FYI, we're doing exchange for this party, and we send it to the closers and we send it to the other side. So that way they know it's going to be an exchange. If you want to do it, this is a great example, but any similar wording will do. I think sometimes the problems with putting it in a listing is that if it's a single family rental or a condominium rental, anyone who's looking online might not know what an exchange is and might skip the property. So you just want to be careful. When do you disclose it's at for a 1031 and when not? And sometimes the clients do not want you to disclose it. It's actually their personal financial tax business. So they may want you to keep it to themselves because they think it might help for bargaining power, what have you. The reality is that 1031 exchange never hurts the other side. It doesn't involve them from a tax perspective or a legal perspective. It's only because in the 1031 tax code, the IRS says, hey, you have to let everybody know you're doing an exchange. So this is why they have the wording. So in the exchange, I talked a little bit about this already. We're the QI down here, and your client, or the seller or the buyer, is the exchanger. So we do documents with them ahead of time before a sale closes. If you leave here with nothing else today, you must remember that a sale cannot close until the 1031 exchange is set up and in place. Everyone should have instructions. You should have seen emails about it from the QI. You've heard about it from the client. Do not assume that the 1031 is taken care of. If you have not heard a peep about it and the closing is coming, whether you're the seller or the buyer or the realtor or the attorney, you should double check and ask the question, is this going to be an exchange? Because the worst phone call that we ever get is that somebody calls, oh, we closed on our property and now we want to do an exchange. So I say closed like you signed a P&S, or did you close, have a closing, receive the funds? If the closing date has passed, all the documents have been signed, the deed, the settlement statement, the closing is over, the escrow is over, the funds have been released or on their way to be released, it is too late to do a 1031 exchange. So that's the worst phone call we ever get, I'm sad to say, and it happens a bit. So you just want to be sure that the exchange is set up before the sale closing date. On the buying side, if we're holding money in a 1031 exchange, we can actually send the deposit. So if people are making an offer and they have to put a small amount down just to make the offer, like $500 or $1,000, they should definitely just do that to get it in there. Don't wait for us. But a QI can send the money from the for the deposit from what they're holding in the exchange account, and people are usually happy to do that. Sometimes they have to put the money in the deal anyway, but other times they're getting a loan or what have you. So having IPX send the deposit really helps their situation. So the basic rules in a 1031, to be 100% deferred, the goal is to buy new property of equal or greater value, number one. We invest all of the proceeds. So I said all the sale proceeds come to IPX after the closing. We hold that money in the exchange account, and then our goal is to wire all of that to the purchase. Number three, if people had debt, mortgages, financing paid off at the sale, they actually have to match that debt on the buying side. If they take any cash at the sale closing, they can do that, but if they do that, they're going to pay capital gains tax on that amount. So the goal is to have equal or greater value, equal or greater debt, and roll all the cash. Receive no cash at closing. And if you do that, it's 100% tax deferred. So there's some misunderstandings that people think you only have to buy something equal to the proceeds or equal to your gain, and neither of those are correct. So we always go over the dollar value rules 1, 2, 3 times to make sure everybody understands it. Equal or greater value, equal or greater debt, and roll all the cash. So just have a quick example here. When you're selling, that's the relinquished property. And when you're buying on this side, this column is the replacement. So in this example, again, easy math, round numbers. We won't put in any closing costs, but we know we have real estate commission gets paid, attorney fees, tax stamps, title company fees, recording fees, everything gets paid as normal. However, we'll just do easy numbers. So you sell for $750, pay off a mortgage of $200,000. You're gonna have $550 at the end of the day from the sale. That amount should get wired to the QI for the exchange. Then when they're ready, the whole $550 should be wired into the purchase. So whatever you're buying, you can bring in mortgage or cash for the difference. So in this example, they went from $750 to $825, so they went up in value. They paid off a mortgage of $200 and got a new one for $275, so they went up in debt, matched the $200 with $275, and they rolled all the cash. Equal or greater value, equal or greater debt, and rolled all the cash. No taxes are due. It's 100% deferred. So that's the goal in the exchange. Can people keep money at the sale closing? Sure, they can. So in the exchange, if they decide, oh, well, I really wanted to keep $50,000 at the sale closing and just send $500 through, you can do that. But that $50,000 that the client receives at the sale closing, that's what they call boot. B as in boy, OOT. So that cash received is boot, and they'll pay capital gains tax on that amount, and then the rest will be deferred. So what happens is that people may decide, well, I want to keep $50,000 because I want to pay for some college or buy a car or pay off other debts. They have to let everybody know before the sale closing. If the money comes to the QI is not allowed to release any money back to that owner, to that taxpayer, until the end of the exchange. So people have to be a little thoughtful, plan ahead. Am I going to keep money at closing? Most people don't. They send everything through the exchange because they want to be 100% tax deferred, but they certainly do have the option to do so. Looks like we have a couple questions. Let me see if I can see these.
I think the main question I saw was, can they please have the slides? And then people were thanking you for such a great program.
So should we keep going for a few minutes, or we want to wrap it up?
Yeah, sure. I think there's probably going to be some questions, but yeah, we want to try to wrap up around 1 to keep on schedule for everyone, because I'm sure they probably have, everyone's got their day planned out. But I want to make sure that you are able to finish what you need to, and then we can open it for questions.
Perfect. So we've already talked about this a little bit. Normal closing costs are always paid. Real estate commissions, attorney fees, all that. So that's all normal, and they're not considered boot. That money that's paid for closing costs is fine in the exchange. So we also, items that do create boot, you have to be careful for. I mentioned, obviously, if you receive any cash at the sale or at the purchase, that's taxable. And then the other thing to note is intermediary cannot use exchange funds to pay for anything for a lender. So if the lender needs loan fees or paying for points or PMI or anything like that, hazard insurance premiums, anything that goes towards lenders, the IRS considers that a boot issue. So you do not want to use exchange funds for that. You want to use other cash funds for those items. The timeline is the other big thing we just want to get out in this conversation. So the 1031 timeline. The clock starts on the day of the sale closing, and you have 45 calendar days to identify what you plan to buy. That's very, very short, no matter whether it's a busy economy or it's slow economy. 45 days is tough. So I always encourage clients, as you're listing your property for sale and waiting for it to close once you have a buyer, you should be working with your realtors to be sure that they can help you find replacement property in a timely manner. You can always make an offer on something to purchase while you're waiting for your sale to close. Sometimes people will call me and they have their sale and their purchase already under contract, and they're ready to go on both. So that's the best scenario. Of course, does not always happen, but you want to be sure that you have 45 days to identify what you're going to buy. You have a full 6 months to close, but that's the easier part. It's this 45 identification. It's very difficult. And one of the trickiest things about the identification is you have to list the exact property address or addresses of what you're going to buy in that 45 days to the intermediary. You cannot change your list for any reason after day 45. And this is a tough rule to follow. And many people get aggravated about this. Like, why does it matter if I found something else I liked, or this property falls through on day 50? Why can't I pick another one? Our hands are tied. It's an IRS rule, and we're just not allowed to send exchange funds to a property address closing that's not identified in 45 days. So this is one of the trickiest things to handle. It's really, a good marketing tool when you're talking about 1031 exchanges. You really want to make sure the clients understand that they have to keep moving. It's a very fluid process. Sometimes it takes longer than others. Maybe you were looking in a certain area. Now it's not a great time to visit that area, but you want to buy there anyway. So you really have to take a lot of those factors into consideration upfront, because the timelines are unwavering. You can identify a couple different ways. You cannot print the entire MLS or entire city or town listing of properties available. You have to narrow that down. So you can identify up to 3 properties of any value. That's the most common rule. So you can list 1, 2, or 3, even if you plan to buy 1, just to give yourself some backups. And in that 45 days, you can add and subtract as much as you want. But at day 45, again, you're locked in. You have to be careful. So there's, advantages and disadvantages to owning investment property. Of course, you have to think about what's right for you and your clients. A lot of conversations go on with their tax advisors, hopefully, and their financial planners. But in the end, the 1031 exchange is just such a good program for everybody. We talk here about vesting, and I just want to make sure everybody knows that any entity can do an exchange, a trust or an individual or corporation, but that same one has to be the buyer. So there are a few exceptions to this when you have trusts, pass-through trusts, grantor trusts, nominee trusts, single member LLCs is a big one. It's pretty popular now. So there definitely are options. So what we try to do is make sure that people understand, and they can always call and talk to us about, will my entity qualify? What if we're in a partnership or LLC with multiple members and we want to go our separate ways? That's a big conversation. Probably takes 2 or 3 times to get it understood and let them figure out what their plan is. So you want to be careful. You have multiple owners on title, that they plan ahead as much as possible. So, again, we're trying to help any way we can. You can use us as a resource up front, behind the scenes. We're here to help you and your clients with the 1031 exchange. And I can certainly send the PowerPoint presentation later on. Now we can open up for questions if there's any, Lisa.
Sure. Yeah, that would be great. If you want to stop sharing your screen so we can go back to a regular screen. But also I want to make sure, I want to make sure, do you have a screen that just has your contact info on it?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, let's put that up so everybody can get a screenshot of that for sure. And then, okay, yeah, was it the first one? Oh, there you go. Yeah. Yeah, so everybody get a screenshot of this, although I will send out the PowerPoint for sure. We can probably do something with it in the video as well.
Yeah, I think what I'll put up the PowerPoint together in a PDF and I'll email it to you. And then I'll have my full contact and you can just, forward it to the whole group.
Okay, that would be great. Do you want to stop sharing the screen again? Let me open it up for questions.
Okay. Yep.
I'm telling Patty, I kind of thought I knew a little bit, but there were a number of things. I didn't realize that, like, if you had a 3-family, you could take 2/3 of it. I didn't realize there was all of that piece of the division of it. There really was quite a bit. I have so anybody got some questions? Of course, I was jotting down things as I always do. Raymar, can you take note of the folks that were on the call? Because we don't have registration for this, that would like a copy of the slides. That would be good. Questions, Corrine, looks like you unmuted.
I did unmute. It's a question about the, it relates to the deferral of the taxes, the 2 out of the 5 years, not necessarily in terms of an exchange. So I don't know if you know the answer to this. I just thought I'd throw it out there. You mentioned that the 2 out of the 5 years, the person has to actually live there. What about like a primary home in Florida, say that, you're there 6 months and a day because you're claiming it as your primary residence, but you don't live there full time?
Yeah, so you have to be super careful. So it's whatever the fact pattern is on the client's tax return. So they either live in one house as a primary residence or they live in the other. And the IRS knows because on your tax return each year, you declare one or the other. So clients have to check with their accountant to say where do we live as our primary residence. The other thing that people call about along that same lines is because of that, one of the other properties is considered a second home, but it's not a rental because they use it. So they cannot use that other property as a 1031 exchange if they're down in Florida or down south for 7 months a year and up here for 5 or something, or, wherever it is, of course, anywhere in the country. They have to be careful because that second home, when they sell it, will have to pay capital gains tax.
Right.
So it'll have the federal and the state. Of course, they don't need depreciation because they haven't taken any, but they'll have the federal and state capital gains tax. So they do have to check with their accountant and see which property they're declaring and decide where am I most of the time to make sure that that's right. They're still doing what they say they are, and which one is more beneficial.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
So two things that stuck out to me that I really don't know, but this is kind of wonky in the weeds. But you mentioned the vacation home rules. Who determines that the market is a vacation home market?
Well, I think it's more about how you rent it. So I guess they pretty much assume if you're renting something seasonally or weekly or what have you, that it's in a vacation or second home area. So it really doesn't matter the location, geographic location, or city and town and state. It's how you're declaring that property as a rental. So I think the vacation and second home is kind of a general term to just say if you're not renting it fully year round, because you could have a property that you are renting full year round, but it's in a vacation area, right? So it's really more about how you use that specific property, how often you rent it, and whether you're using it personally, like family use, personal enjoyment, things like that. So that's what you're really more watching for, as opposed to the exact location of the property.
Yeah, I think it's probably been tested more with with Airbnb, that kind of a model, and then areas like where we are with VRBO, I need a vacation, properties that people are renting themselves, and then like in Massachusetts, as we started to require rooms tax, that had to come out of the closet from a lot of people that were doing the business prior to that really weren't reporting all of that. So I think that has changed the scenario. I know I have a lot of clients that come down and at first they say, oh yeah, I'm going to buy a second home. It's going to be so great. But just for the first couple of years, I'm going to rent it out a little bit until they realize that it's a lot more complicated than that, and I would say 9.75 times out of 10, they don't decide to rent because
really? Yeah.
well, because of the complications, with the rooms tax and insurance, and then if they have any kind of complication about maybe wanting to, do something with that property in less than 2 years. Yeah, so yeah, it is a little more complicated, I think, than
the other thing
thought.
that we have kind of along those lines that we see that sometimes is a problem for clients is that they do rent it some and they don't declare it. So maybe because of the tax or whatever, it depends on the state, of course, but they might rent it out and they don't declare it because they don't think they need to. And if it's under 2 weeks a year, you don't have to. But if it's more than 2 weeks, you should. And then what happens is because they're not declaring it, when they go to sell it and they say, oh, we do rent it out. I said, but if you haven't declared it, the IRS doesn't know you've rented it out. So they kind of get stuck in this quandary, right? So, but I'm sure that must have something to do with it, having to declare it and pay the taxes depending on the state, what their requirements are.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, again, it's a deferral. It's not a elimination of the tax liability. The only other thing that I'm a little confused on, just to get clear, and then it's 106, let everybody go. You talked about equal debt. I don't think I was aware of that either. So what if the debt is less? Does that create boot with the two debts?
Yeah,
200 debt, the first thing, two, and you said 250, whatever it was. What if my debt and the second purchase is only 150 because I have more cash? I mean, I would that people wouldn't probably do that. You want to leverage somebody else's
yeah.
money, but if they did, what if the
Sometimes they
debt
do
was
though. Yeah.
equal?
I think that sometimes people want to have less debt. And so it's really about the numbers. So it's not whether you physically have a mortgage versus put in cash. It's about the matching the debt number. So if you're selling a property for that, say it was 750, I think, right? So if you're selling for 750, then your goal is to buy something for 750 or greater, minus the closing costs. So it's really 750 minus your closing costs. So maybe that's 720 is your net sale price. That's really what you're supposed to be buying, equal or greater to. So that's the same as saying, I'm going to use all my cash in the purchase, and whatever mortgage I paid off, I'm going to match that on the buying side with either new debt and or new cash.
Okay.
So
Oh, so it is. I
have,
just was confused when you brought that equal debt. So I always knew it had to be equal or greater, but I didn't know about that debt caveat, and I thought it meant if I borrowed less money or didn't borrow money, I was going to have to pay boot on that differential. But you don't.
no, so
You don't.
but people, the reason I put that in there is because people think you don't have to match your debt. You only have to put in the cash. Like people
Yeah.
don't
No.
think
The
they have to
value.
match that 200 or 250 on the buying side. And they do, because debt relief is a benefit. So it's taxable at the capital
Right.
gains rate. So yeah, so it's definitely a little bit confusing, the rules, but the goal is all the cash from the sale should go through the exchange and into the purchase. And you should come to the closing matching the debt payoff with either new
Yep.
debt and or new cash or any
Right. Right. Right.
combination. Yeah.
Right. 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 All right. Any other questions from these folks that have stuck around for this great discussion? No? All right. Well, thank you. Oh my gosh, this has been so great. I really,
Oh,
I kind of love this. I mean, I did happen to have been married to a Jewish accountant in my first my first marriage, so I was around a lot of numbers and tax stuff. But I find it fascinating. I think it's such a great tool for people to be able to at least be aware of as realtors, so that we sound a little more intelligent when we're talking to our clients. When they bring up, oh, I might do an exchange, and you say, oh, do you have a QI? At least you're supposed to say that stuff.
exactly. And I think, I'm happy to be a resource behind the scenes or up front. Sometimes people will email me and CC their client. Sometimes they'll just pass my information on. So whatever I can do to help, I'm happy to do so. Happy to be the resource.
All right. Thank you so much, Patty. We really appreciate
Okay.
everything.
Bye. Thank you all.
All
Have
right.
a great day. Bye-bye.